Most people think war, poverty, or chaos are the biggest dangers in history. But the truth? The most terrifying killers don't wait for those moments. They use them. From London's blackout nights in World War II to the quiet farmlands of rural France and even the small towns of America's South, ordinary streets hid predators who rewrote the rules of fear. One hunted women under the cover of bombs falling from the sky. Another drifted from village to village, leaving bodies in ditches that no one could explain. And one was a grandmotherly figure who smiled as she served her victims their final meal. These are three of the most disturbing serial killers history has tried to forget, each story darker than the last. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. London in 1942 was already a city suffocating under fear. The nightly wail of air raid sirens, the thud of bombs falling from German planes, and the endless blackout curtains that turned every street into a shadowy maze made survival feel like a daily miracle. But in the middle of this wartime terror, another predator lurked, one not sent by Hitler's Luftwaffe, but born of London itself. His name was Gordon Cummins, and history remembers him as the Blackout Ripper. On the surface, Cummins was an ordinary man. A Royal Air Force officer stationed in London, he blended into the restless population of soldiers, workers, and civilians who moved through the city by day and hid from firestorms by night. But behind his uniform was a darkness that took advantage of the chaos around him. Cummins understood that the blackout made Londoners vulnerable, with streets unlit, strangers unrecognizable, and danger already accepted as part of life. He had the perfect hunting ground. In early February of 1942, he struck with brutal precision. His victims were women, many of them working as prostitutes or simply trying to navigate the dangerous nights alone. Their bodies were discovered in flats, air raid shelters, and darkened rooms, strangled or slashed, their injuries so savage that investigators were shocked at the frenzy behind them. The war had already normalized death, but these killings carried a personal savagery that bombs could never replicate. Within 6 days, Cummins murdered at least 4 women and attacked 2 others, creating panic not just because of the killings themselves, but because of the horrifying realization that Londoners were not only at risk from the skies above, but from a predator walking the very same streets they did. He left behind a trail of brutality so sudden and ferocious that newspapers rushed to name him, coining the title The Blackout Ripper, a grim echo of Jack the Ripper from half a century earlier. What made his crimes even more chilling was their speed. Bombers might devastate a city block in minutes, but Cummins carried out his spree with a swiftness that seemed almost supernatural, weaving murder into the already unbearable chaos of war. The murders attributed to Gordon Cummins shocked even a city hardened by nightly bombings because they revealed a different kind of terror. One that came not from faceless enemy aircraft overhead, but from a man who moved silently among them, wearing the uniform of protection while carrying out acts of extraordinary cruelty. Between February 9th and 13th, 1942, 4 women were found brutally murdered, and 2 others narrowly escaped with their lives. Each victim bore the marks of strangulation, mutilation, or slashing, crimes carried out with a level of violence that suggested rage rather than desperation. What investigators quickly noticed, however, was the efficiency of his attacks. He seemed to know when to strike, moments when the streets were empty, when the blackouts cloaked his movements, when the victims were most isolated. The speed of his spree left detectives scrambling. Unlike Jack the Ripper, who spread his murders over months, the Blackout Ripper compressed his terror into a single week, as though he knew his window of opportunity was narrow and had to be exploited fully. Panic spread quickly, amplified by newspapers eager to stoke fear and by whispers in air raid shelters where women now looked suspiciously at the very men meant to defend them. The idea that a uniformed RAF officer could be responsible unsettled the public most of all because it blurred the line between protector and predator. Police worked frantically to trace his movements, interviewing witnesses, following fragments of clues left at the crime scenes. At one flat, a gas mask belonging to a serviceman was discovered, stamped with identifying numbers that eventually pointed directly to Cummins. It was a mistake born of arrogance or haste, but it was enough to narrow the hunt. When investigators finally closed in on him, they found not a frantic, disheveled madman, but a calm, almost charming officer, a man who denied everything even as the evidence piled up. His demeanor unsettled detectives because he did not seem weighed down by guilt or even particularly concerned with the charges. Instead, he behaved as though the trial and the headlines were inconveniences, mere interruptions in a life he expected to continue. But the brutality of the murders and the pressure on police to stop him ensured that the case would not fade quietly into the background of war. In a city already scarred by bombs and loss, the capture of the Blackout Ripper became a matter of restoring trust, proving that even in wartime chaos, justice could still reach those who exploited it. The trial of Gordon Cummins was brief but unforgettable, a chilling display of how quickly a city already torn apart by war could turn its focus inward when confronted with the horror of a predator in uniform. Cummins was charged with multiple murders, though investigators believed he may have been responsible for more deaths beyond the 4 confirmed killings and 2 attacks of that single week in February 1942. In court, his demeanor remained eerily composed. Witnesses described him as almost indifferent, a man more irritated by the inconvenience of the proceedings than burdened by guilt. The evidence, however, was overwhelming. The gas mask he had left behind during one attack carried his identifying number. Fibers and fingerprints tied him directly to victims, and the sheer proximity of his movements to the murders left no doubt. The speed of the trial matched the speed of his crimes. In April of 1942, only weeks after his spree, Cummins was found guilty and sentenced to death. The execution came swiftly. On June 25, 1942, in London's Wandsworth prison, Gordon Cummins was hanged, his body buried quickly without ceremony. The press declared that justice had been done, and in a city desperate for relief, his death provided a small measure of closure, yet the Blackout Ripper's crimes left behind a legacy of unease that outlasted him. His spree revealed how the conditions of war, the blackouts, the chaos, the anonymity of crowded shelters and bombed-out streets, created perfect cover for a predator who needed only a week to leave scars that would last decades. More unsettling still was the fact that his victims were ordinary women simply trying to survive a war already filled with terror from above. Cummins proved that evil doesn't pause for bombs, that war does not stop personal monsters from walking among us. And as London tried to put the Blackout Ripper behind them, another European country was wrestling with its own predator decades earlier. A drifter who stalked the countryside of rural France in the 1890s, leaving behind bodies in ditches and fields, his crimes so brutal that he was nicknamed the French Ripper. His name was Joseph Vacher, and his story remains one of the most haunting in French criminal history. In the late 19th century, France's rural heartlands lived in a fragile quiet. Villages nestled between fields and forests relied on the rhythm of farming, the faith of the church, and the trust that the countryside, unlike the crowded cities, was safe. But beginning in the mid-1890s, that illusion shattered. A wandering man began moving from province to province, and wherever he went, bodies followed. His name was Joseph Vacher, and history would call him the French Ripper. Born in 1869 to a poor farming family in southeastern France, Vacher's childhood was bleak and suffocating, his family strict, his early years marked by isolation and harsh discipline. By the time he was a young man, he carried with him not just resentment, but a growing instability that would soon explode into violence. He briefly joined the army, but his erratic behavior, coupled with a doomed obsession with a woman who rejected him, spiraled into disaster. In 1893, after the woman spurned his marriage proposal, he shot her and then turned the gun on himself, firing into his own head. Miraculously, he survived, but the bullet left permanent scars, his face disfigured with a twisted jaw and his mind haunted by an ever-widening crack between reality and delusion. When he emerged back into society, he was described as unsettling, his appearance alone enough to draw stares, but it was his behavior that turned him into a specter. From 1894 onward, Vacher drifted across rural France, presenting himself as a vagabond, a beggar moving from farm to farm. But his wanderings concealed something darker. In lonely fields and quiet woods, bodies began appearing. Shepherd boys, young women, travelers caught alone on empty roads. Their throats were slashed, their bodies mutilated, sometimes desecrated. Crimes carried out with savagery that seemed almost animal. At first, each case seemed like an isolated tragedy, but slowly, whispers spread. A scarred drifter had been seen near every village before the killings, a stranger with wild eyes who vanished as quickly as he appeared. Fear crept into the countryside, and the myth of a phantom killer grew. Farmers armed themselves when working the fields, parents forbade their children from wandering alone, and the once peaceful roads of rural France became haunted by the knowledge that a predator roamed freely. It was the birth of a legend that would terrorize the nation for years, and as the body count grew, Joseph Vacher cemented his place as one of Europe's most feared and least remembered serial killers. The challenge investigators faced with Joseph Vacher was unlike anything the French countryside had ever seen, because his crimes stretched across provinces, leaving behind a trail so scattered that for years no one realized they were connected. Rural policing in the 1890s was fragmented. Small gendarmerie units handled local cases, but communication between towns was limited, meaning that each new body discovered was treated as an isolated tragedy rather than part of a larger spree. This allowed Vacher to drift undetected, moving from village to village under the guise of a harmless beggar or itinerant laborer. He would ask for food, offer to do odd jobs, or simply pass himself off as a traveler looking for rest. And most people, out of charity or pity, offered him kindness. What they didn't realize was that they were feeding and sheltering a predator who was watching, waiting for the moment he could isolate a victim. His attacks followed a terrifyingly simple pattern. He struck when opportunity aligned, a shepherd boy alone in the fields, a young woman gathering wood, or a solitary traveler making the long walk between towns. He would approach, strike suddenly with a knife, and leave his victims mutilated in ways that shocked even hardened investigators. Many were found with throats slashed, their bodies violently torn, sometimes left in ditches, sometimes concealed only hastily under brush. Witnesses occasionally reported seeing him wandering nearby before or after an attack, but he vanished too quickly for anyone to act. Slowly, however, his name began to surface in police reports, and descriptions of a scarred drifter with a twisted jaw matched across different provinces. The break came in August 1897, when Vacher attempted to assault a young farm girl in the countryside. This time, however, he was subdued by locals and handed over to authorities, who immediately suspected he might be tied to other unsolved cases. Under interrogation, Vacher at first denied responsibility, but soon, with unnerving calm, he began to confess. He admitted to killing at least 11 people, though investigators suspected the number was higher, possibly exceeding 20. What struck police most was the matter-of-fact way he described the murders, as if they were acts of compulsion he could not resist, driven by what he claimed were voices commanding him to kill. He told psychiatrists that after surviving his self-inflicted gunshot, he believed he was under divine influence, that God or supernatural forces had chosen him to cleanse the countryside through violence. Yet even as he claimed madness, he recalled details with precision, demonstrating an awareness of his actions that contradicted his pleas of insanity. The public was horrified when the scale of his crimes became clear. Newspapers labeled him Le Tueur de Bergers, the killer of shepherds, and parents across France shuddered at the thought of how many children and young workers had fallen into his path. The trial that followed drew national attention, not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but because of the debate raging at the time about criminal responsibility and insanity. Was Vacher insane, a madman whose actions were the product of delusion? Or was he fully conscious, a calculating murderer hiding behind the excuse of madness? Experts debated, testimonies clashed, but in the end, the jury leaned toward the latter. He knew what he was doing, and he enjoyed it. The trial of Joseph Vacher in 1898 became one of the most sensational court proceedings in French history, not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but because it forced the nation to confront its understanding of evil, madness, and justice. The courtroom was packed with journalists, curious citizens, and grieving families desperate to see the man who had transformed their countryside into a hunting ground. Vacher sat before them with his disfigured jaw and unsettling stare, calm as he listened to the charges. He pleaded insanity, claiming divine voices had driven him to kill, but the prosecution countered with evidence that showed he was not a man lost in delusion, but a predator who chose his moments with precision. Witnesses described seeing him wandering near villages before attacks. Psychiatrists testified that although he was disturbed, he understood right from wrong, and his own detailed confessions betrayed an awareness of his crimes. The jury did not take long to decide. In October 1898, Joseph Vacher was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. On December 31st of that year, as France prepared to enter a new century, Vacher was led to the guillotine in Bourg-en-Bresse. Reports said he remained eerily composed, his face as expressionless as ever, until the blade fell and ended his reign of terror. But the scars he left on the French countryside endured. Parents continued to warn their children not to wander alone. Shepherds watched their flocks with new vigilance, and his name lingered in whispers for decades as a reminder that the most dangerous threats can come from the solitary figure walking quietly down a country road. What makes Vacher's story so chilling, even today, is how he thrived in the very spaces people believed to be safe. The countryside had always been seen as an escape from the dangers of crowded cities, a place of peace, yet he turned those fields and forests into a stage for horror. In this, Vacher's crimes echo those of Gordon Cummins in wartime London. Both men exploited the vulnerabilities of their times, using chaos and isolation as cover for violence. And just as France tried to move past the phantom who stalked its farmlands, America in the 1970s faced its own shock, not from a drifter or a soldier, but from a woman whose outward appearance was grandmotherly, even gentle. Her name was Velma Barfield, and beneath her soft-spoken demeanor, she became one of the most disturbing female serial killers in American history. When Americans in the 1970s thought of serial killers, they often pictured nameless predators lurking in alleys or roaming highways. What they did not expect was that one of the nation's most chilling killers would be a grandmotherly figure from rural North Carolina, a soft-spoken woman who attended church, carried a Bible, and seemed to live an ordinary life. Her name was Velma Barfield, and history would remember her not for the hymns she sang, but for the poison she quietly slipped into the meals of those who trusted her most. Born in 1932, Velma grew up in a poor household, raised in a strict environment where discipline and hardship were constant. She married young, had children, and seemed destined for a simple domestic life. But beneath the surface of her ordinary exterior lay struggles that would shape her into one of the most notorious female killers in American history. She battled chronic health problems and became addicted to prescription drugs, a dependency that worsened as her life spiraled. After her first husband died in suspicious circumstances, Velma remarried, but tragedy seemed to follow her. Each man in her life either left or died, and with every passing year, she leaned further into deceit and manipulation. What investigators would later uncover was that Velma's answer to hardship, inconvenience, or even financial strain was as simple as it was horrifying: poison. Using arsenic-laced rat poison, she began slipping lethal doses into food and drink, masking the symptoms as natural illness. In an era and a region where healthcare was limited and sudden sickness was often blamed on strokes, heart attacks, or infections, her victims' agonizing deaths went unquestioned. Friends, lovers, even her own mother, all fell to her poison, and each time she donned the mask of grief, playing the role of a mourning widow or daughter, while quietly benefiting from the removal of those who stood in her way. To neighbors and churchgoers, Velma seemed pious and kind, the sort of woman who volunteered at services and prayed over her family. Yet inside her kitchen and behind closed doors, she was calculating doses of death. It was this duality, the outward face of devotion and the hidden hand of murder, that made her story so disturbing, because it reminded the world that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it smiles at you while passing the salt across the dinner table. The pattern of Velma Barfield's killings unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, until investigators began piecing together the strange string of deaths surrounding her. Her second husband, Jennings Barfield, was the first major red flag. In 1971, only months after their marriage, Jennings fell violently ill and died. At the time, doctors attributed his death to natural causes, never suspecting that Velma had poisoned him. His sudden passing left her widowed yet again, and while she grieved publicly, she privately continued her descent into prescription drug addiction and financial desperation. Soon after, other deaths began to follow in her orbit. Her own mother, who lived with her, suddenly became sick and died under circumstances that raised no suspicion at the time. Elderly neighbors she occasionally cared for suffered similar fates. Even her romantic partners met the same end. Velma's weapon of choice was arsenic-based poison, a substance easy to obtain and easy to disguise in food or drink. Victims would become violently ill, experiencing nausea, abdominal pain, and vomiting, symptoms that often resembled heart problems or digestive illnesses. In rural North Carolina during the 1970s, where access to advanced medical testing was limited, these deaths slipped beneath the radar. What made Velma especially dangerous was her ability to play the role of caregiver while secretly being the executioner. She would nurse her victims as they weakened, sitting by their bedsides, reading them Bible verses, praying aloud, and appearing as the devoted daughter, partner, or friend. This performance of compassion deflected suspicion and allowed her to strike again and again. But her mask began to crack in 1977 when Stuart Taylor, a man she was romantically involved with, fell suddenly and violently ill. Doctors became suspicious after discovering arsenic in his system, and an investigation into Velma's past quickly revealed a string of deaths that no longer looked natural. Exhumations of her previous victims showed the same traces of poison. Velma was arrested, and when confronted with the mounting evidence, she confessed with startling calm. She admitted to poisoning multiple people, explaining at times that she did it to cover up financial problems, at other times blaming her drug addiction or claiming she simply couldn't help it. What unsettled investigators most was her lack of visible remorse. the way she spoke of her actions as if they were matters of circumstance rather than deliberate murder. By the time the full scope of her crimes became clear, Velma Barfield had been tied to at least 6 deaths, though suspicions lingered that she may have been responsible for more. The trial of Velma Barfield captivated not only North Carolina but the entire country because it was rare for a woman, and rarer still for a grandmotherly, church-going woman, to stand accused of serial murder. The courtroom was packed with journalists and curious citizens who wanted to see for themselves how someone who looked so ordinary could harbor such darkness. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically. The pattern of sudden deaths surrounding Velma, the exhumed bodies that revealed traces of arsenic, her calm confession, and the financial motives that often tied her to the killings. The defense attempted to paint her as a victim of drug addiction and mental illness, a woman broken by her dependency on prescription medications, who lost control of her actions under the influence of her need. But the jury saw through the explanation. The evidence was too overwhelming, the deaths too many, the poison too deliberate. In 1978, Velma Barfield was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Appeals stretched on for years, with her attorneys arguing that her life should be spared because of her gender, her addiction, and her newfound religious devotion. Indeed, during her years on death row, Velma leaned heavily into her faith, becoming known as the Death Row Granny, leading Bible studies for fellow inmates and earning support from religious figures who saw her as redeemed. But for the families of her victims, her outward piety in prison did little to erase the memory of the lives she had taken. After years of appeals, the courts upheld her sentence, and in 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection, the first woman in the United States to be executed after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. To some, her final moments symbolized justice served. To others, they stood as a troubling reminder of how a seemingly gentle woman could live a double life of caregiver and killer. Her story, placed alongside Gordon Cummins and Joseph Vasher, highlights a grim truth about serial killers. They thrive not just on violence, but on the masks they wear. Cummins used the uniform of war to shield his savagery. Vasher hid behind the rags of a beggar as he stalked the countryside. Velma cloaked herself in the guise of a church-going grandmother. 3 killers, 3 disguises, but the same horrifying reality. Evil often hides behind the most ordinary faces. And by the time the mask slips, it is already too late. Evil doesn't always creep through shadows. Sometimes it wears a uniform, begs at your door, or smiles across the dinner table. Gordon Cummins, Joseph Vasher, and Velma Barfield proved that killers can hide in plain sight, turning ordinary moments into traps. If these stories unsettled you, subscribe now, and tell me in the comments which case haunted you most. Because the past may be gone, but its monsters never really leave.